Hey guys, I'm Eyob, also commonly known as Joe. That's my alter ego, my Canadian version. But I recovering from adrenaline addiction slash codependency would be probably the two main things that have been the drivers in my life. And today, what I want to talk to you actually is in the context of someone who has struggled with codependency. Uh, and how do you set boundaries when you've never really learned to set boundaries or even understood what healthy boundaries look like? And so, and the reason why I wanted to chat about that today and share it with you guys is because currently I'm with my three kids, living with my aging parents, with a wife, and also my brother's in there. Um, and my father deals with some mental health issues. He's aging. And my mother, actually, last night we were at the hospital all night because she had a pre-major panic attack. And and what I witnessed is that I grew up in a culture and an environment that had no boundaries. So if in my culture, to have a boundary is actually considered you're almost, it's an offense. And and it's interesting because my wife, who is Canadian, and was raised actually in a culture where you have personal autonomy in the sense that you as an individual know who you are, and it's something that is cultivated. And so one of the things my mom always has recently noticed about my wife is that, wow, she really takes care of herself, that she creates space for well-being, and it's something that I've really had a challenge. And also I think everyone in my family has been challenged with, because the idea of being quote unquote independent is considered again to be outside of this collectivist culture that ultimately looks at everything through the prism of the community, which is healthy in many ways. And I think in Canada, we need a lot of that, but also it can create some really unhealthy relationships because you don't know where you start and also where you end. And so this season, I've been learning to set healthy boundaries. So before, my concept of a boundary, it was like a, a reaction to what I'd experienced because I was raised in that environment where I didn't have my personal autonomy in many ways. As soon as I turned 17 and moved away to college, I just stopped talking to everybody. I literally set this quote unquote boundary, and and everybody was just like, what's going on with this guy? Like, why is he not talking? But it's because I didn't know anything else. And so for the first time, I had this freedom. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. And I went to the extreme side of it. And ultimately, it led me to addiction, interesting enough. So, in a weird way, my boundary brought me to isolate. And isolation always ultimately is the root of addiction. And so then, of course, I no longer had that community. I didn't have that safety net. And so for most of my life, then I was in many respects always looking for a community. Even when I was pastoring, I had challenge in the sense that I was pastor. I mean, you can't be any more connected than a pastor, but yet often I always felt never part of the community, strangely enough. And it's like, well, how is that possible? I would be in a crowd of people and I would be the life of the party, but I would almost feel like the loneliest person in that community. And part of it was just starting to understand this concept of even identity. I didn't really know who I was. And so I want to share this passage with you guys because this passage really helped me. It was from Ephesians 3:16-19. It says that he would grant you, according to the riches of his glory, to be strengthened with power through his spirit in the inner man, so that Christ may dwell in your hearts through faith, and that you, being rooted and grounded in love, may be able to comprehend with all the saints what is the breadth and length and height and depth, and to know the love of Christ, which surpasses knowledge, that you may be filled up all with the fullness of God. And this was like a whole new concept and definition of love for me, which was like this idea of being rooted and grounded in love. Like, what does it actually mean to love people? And I realized for the longest time, I didn't really know how to love people because I wasn't grounded in love. My identity wasn't grounded in Christ. It was grounded in my community, or it was grounded in people often, because I didn't know, I didn't really actually have this relationship that was specifically with God, who is love, who's the expression. So if I can't even experience the love of God and understand it, how can I even give that love? So my concept of love then was, oh, I'll just really enmeshment. Let me not just, you know, love you. Let me go to the nth degree to show you how much I was compensating. And I was always looking to please and appease. That was the cycle that I was living in. It was this idea, like, that was my concept of love. So when I was pastoring, if someone called me in the middle of the night, it didn't matter. I'd get up and I'd be on the road to, because that's what Christ would do. That's what love looks like. When in reality, I was just a human being that had no concept of what love was, because I thought I was acting out of love. But in many respects, all I was doing was acting out of being needed, being wanted, because that's such a big deal for me. So what I thought I was, when I was loving people, all I was doing was actually using people to meet this need that I had. That was insatiable in many respects too. So it was never satisfied. So people, for me, had become my drug. I started consuming people. And the relationships that I would enter into were also, you attract the same type of people. So the people that I had also had no boundaries. So we are these boundaryless people. And imagine, especially in the Christian community, you add a little bit of wrong theology in there, and it becomes a disaster, really. Like it becomes this really dangerous environment, because you literally don't know where you start and where you end, or where the other individual is. And so everybody is in this weird codependent relationship. And then we use spirituality to justify it as being the right thing. So once I was really struggling with that, my sister started giving me the book, Boundaries book, by Dr. Henry Cloud, and started reading that. And I started getting like an understanding and a definition. And this is interesting. So when you look at the Webster's Dictionary, this is what a boundary is, according to Webster's Dictionary: is something that indicates bounds or limits. Imagine that. By definition, a boundary is not a negative, but part of existing, in the sense that we all have bounds and limits. And I think for me, it's like realizing I didn't have boundaries, my relation, and it spilled out into my business and all these areas, because I didn't have any limits. I was a boundaryless individual. So I looked at actually boundary for the longest time as a negative. But what this definition is telling us is it's just part of existing. It's what identifies who we are and who we're not. So if we don't know who we are, then it'll be next to impossible to set any level of boundaries, because we're always feeling guilty. And so what I learned, and it's been recent even, is that boundaries not only define what already exists, but that you can't simply also build fences around your life and call it a boundary. And I didn't know that. So for me, it was always the extreme reaction. It's this teenager side of me, in the sense that I would feel exposed and I'd feel hurt in relationships. And so I would do the extreme thing, which is like, oh, I'm just going to set some boundaries. And so what I would do is I would just freeze people out. I would stop talking to them. I would just go, okay, done with you, and move along. Um, and so I think the mistake that I made as I look back in my life was that I was trying to establish guidelines, rules, limits, without first actually really establishing my identity in Christ and who I was. I had it upside down. So what happens is that these rules, guidelines, and limits, when they precede your identity, then you really create a self-imposed prison, and you don't even realize you're in it. Like you created your own prison, and you don't even. So then I become confined, and I'm never ever able to be free to be who God created me to be. And so most of the time, then of course, I'm like no different than a person in jail. Um, and so what I think, as I'm in this stage of my recovery and healing, and it's really difficult for me, I'll tell you this, is saying no to me was like an F word. Like it was profanity. Like, oh, you never say no. Like you're always saying. But where did I learn that? My mother. My mother could be on her deathbed and ill, and if she had an event to do or whatever, she would do it. I was just talking to my sister this morning about, the hospitalization for my mom, and I was like, wow, isn't it interesting that a couple of months ago she was really sick, and she literally demanded that I would drive her to this party because she had to show, because this was a graduation party and she really loved this person and she had to be there. And I'm like, but you're sick. And she's like, no, I have to be there. And it almost like it was a spirit that came out of her when I was like, no, I'm not driving you. And she's like, no, like it was just like, whoa, the addiction was like, it was that codependency. It was just profound. And so then, of course, I felt guilty immediately because that's the relationship. So I'm like, okay, I whatever boundary I had established in that moment, which was like, I don't do that. I was like, okay, I have to, because I was driven by guilt. And so then I end up driving her to this party, and I'm at a friend's where they don't even have reception. She gets sick there, and she's calling me, and I don't know she's calling me. So finally, when I leave the friends, and it was like really late, 11 or whatever it is, she's like, where have you been? And I'm like, what are you talking about? She's like, I've been sick. You need to come now. So I'm on right away. Like I drive my family, and then boom, I'm there. And I'm sitting there, and now I have to spend, all this time. And then she's sick for the next 2 weeks. And I was like angry the next day, because I realized, because she doesn't have boundaries, she's pulled me into her world. And because I can't say no, I'm pulled into this mess. And then it creates this cascading effect where it impacts my relationships and then my kids. And then it never ends. And if I could have just said no, that whole incident, that whole episode would have been like done. It would have been like, listen, take over. Like if you want to do it, go do it. Like call a friend, but I'm not going to participate and enjoying your madness. But it's so hard when you're in a culture that doesn't adhere to that. And for me, that's been the challenge. It's like always feeling in the middle of this stuff and stuck, and sometimes not understanding what is true love in this moment. And I'm reminded, like when I read the story of the Good Samaritan, that's a guy who really had a great boundary and a sense of who he was, because he met the need, like unlike the other guys, which had really horrible boundaries. Like their boundaries was out of resentment. They just didn't help the guy. Like the Jewish lawyer, like they They just went about their business. And that's what the law does, is establishes an imposed prison, and they have no grace, no nothing. And so that's the extreme side of it. And then the other extreme side traditionally for me would have been like, hey, you're the guy, you meet the need, you bandage the guy, you live with him, you forget your business affairs and all that stuff. But there's the biblical concept, which is so beautiful. It's like, no, you do the best that you can within the limits and bounds. And he had limits and bounds. He helps the guy to his best of ability and then leaves him at the hotel and then basically says, hey, he's a businessman. So he's like, what here? He's going to stay here, and whatever the fee is, I'll take care of it. And he continues on because he had other responsibilities. And for me, that's where I'm at right now in the season of my life, is that what is like a person who's codependent, I'm realizing this, doesn't actually know their self-worth. And they don't really value time. They don't really understand that they have been entrusted time to manage time. And I'm realizing now that the better that I'm getting with saying no to people, I'm starting to manage my time. I'm starting to find out that I actually have way more time than I've ever had before. My big thing used to be like, oh man, I'm too busy. I don't have enough time. I got to be doing this. But it's because I was in all these codependent relationships and I was trying to manage them all to meet this need that I had. So this is the thing. So my lesson in this season is that my boundaries cannot be motivated by fear, because if they're motivated by fear, then they are an imposed prison. And I was thinking about that in government and all this stuff. Every time there's a crazy incident, like in parliament buildings, when there was an event that happened where this guy almost killed somebody, and like all of a sudden they imposed a boundary that was based on fear, because they're like, okay, we gotta, we can't let people on the lawn of the prominent buildings. We can't do all these limits were set up. Even with COVID, the same thing. It's like suddenly, because of fear, we set up all these crazy limits where we actually isolated people and created even a greater mess. Like, look at the amount of people that are addicted, and look the amount of people that are dealing with health issues because of the overreaction to an event of that we don't understand. So in this season, my response is like, when things happen, how am I responding? Am I responding out of love or out of fear? And often if it's out of fear, then it's always going to isolate me. But if it's from love, then it's not, it still has, I'm behaving based on who I am and what I have to offer in that moment, which is so beautiful. And that's the love of God. And that love of God is sufficient for that person. I can't heal this person. I can't cure them. And it's so humbling to be in a season where I'm like, I can't fix anyone. I just have to trust God. And I'll tell you, for me, that's challenging often, because I want to rescue. But I'm realizing when I rescue, then I'm playing God. And my mom, like, that's the story of our conversation. We were in the emergency for 10 hours and they did all these checks. In the end, it was a panic attack. And I'm talking to her and I said, Mom, you're not God. Like, you're carrying the burden of my dad, me, your daughters, your son, the people back home in Africa. I mean, do you not realize, like you're not God? But she's so addicted to playing that role because that's been established culturally. So for her, it's like an anthem. It's like the idea of me, even there, she's fighting me. So she's thinking, okay, well, the solution to this problem is just medication. I just need some anti-anxiety stuff so that I don't feel the symptoms. But that's the warning sign. So the panic attack, anxieties, all that stuff is just a byproduct of us having zero boundaries and trying to play the role of God. And here's the revelation I had recently. God has boundaries. And the story of the prodigal son is a father with boundaries. Because that's a picture of God and his relationship. And his son is like, hey, I want my stuff. And the father is like, okay, here's your inheritance prematurely. Take it. He never goes and chases him down. He stays. His disposition towards his child never changes. His love is firm. But guess what? That child had to come to his own senses. And God allows us to come to the end of ourselves. And then he's there when we're finally ready with his grace to love us. But there's an act, and that's the act of surrender, that moment of the prodigal seeing the reality of his life and the mess of his life and just saying, okay, done. And that's when the transformation starts. It begins. And so for me, that's my disposition. And it's so difficult to not play God. And that's really what codependency is. It's the sin of pride. It's actually one of the more that I'm starting to understand now. And it's actually, I was writing this little article for Rubies, and the article is all about, like, so you think you're not an addict and it's still codependent. And it was about John's and Vicky's relationship. And there's this part there where John says, you have to be really sick to be with an addict for 14 years. Who's sicker? And I'm realizing now, it's like, my addiction problem, that was pretty easy, actually, because I was hurting myself to something. At the end of the day, it was my dumb, stupid solution. But codependency is so much more difficult to address because it's camouflaged with all these wonderful attributes, which is like, oh, you're so caring, you're so compassionate. It's like, and that's the culture right now, the social justice culture. It's all codependency. It's fueled by it, and it's so sickening. So I'm just becoming more aware of how sick I've been for so long. And this is a daily work for me because it's rooted in family and culture and history. And I have to literally uproot myself from that identity and reclaim my true identity in Christ. And that's really where I'm at in this season.